Welcome once again to the 18th edition of the Women's Forum 2023. If you were here yesterday, you remember me introducing myself so eloquently. And I said to you, my name is Siyabulela Mandela. I'm a descendant of the House of Mandela, the descendant of King Gubengcuka. That was very critical. Many of you wouldn't have understood what I was saying and the intention of giving you that kind of introduction. You know, growing up constantly within the family, we come from a royal family, so constantly they will ask you a question, who are you? Where do you belong? Where are you from? And constantly they will tell you, your name is Siyabulela Mandela. You are the descendant of King Gubengcuka from the Tembu Kingdom. You stand in the shoulders of your ancestors, Madiba Sopicha, Yem Ngolom Sila, Velabam Benzele, Zonda, Zinchaba, Nobazgam Zonda, Ngekes Zimenzent. That was critical so that in the journey of life, as I progress, I know who I am and I know where I belong. And if anyone tells me otherwise, I'll look at them and say, I know who I am and I know where I belong. So now, we are going back and we are asking you a question, who you are and where do you belong as women? It doesn't matter what field that you are in. It doesn't matter what you do, but the question is, where do you belong? And now, the BCG Masterclass is all about belonging and inclusion. And to join us on stage on this masterclass, take it from the master of ceremony, right? It's a masterclass indeed. We have Gabrielle Novacek, the managing director and partner of Boston Consulting Group, to engage with us on belonging, inclusion, and saying belonging is good business. That's a masterclass. Let's welcome Gabrielle. Give her a round of applause.
Good morning, everybody. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be joining all of you in this remarkable city at this remarkable time of year. I'd like to actually start with a little bit of a story. A couple of weeks ago, I was back visiting my parents' house, and like many of us at our age are wont to do, was asked to start sifting through the detritus of my childhood that still sits in their house. As part of that process, I found boxes and boxes of photographs from my childhood. And I started to look through those photographs, and what did I see? It was picture after picture of me with this gang of friends who were so critical and so central to my childhood. And when I looked at those friends, what did I see? I saw my friend Michael, who desperately wanted to be an inventor and who would steal the family toaster and go hide in his bedroom and pick apart the toaster to try to figure out how it worked. I saw my friend Mariam, who was a war refugee who had come to Canada and was so mesmerized by snow every single year that she saw it and would spend hours outside playing and building forts and fortresses out of it. And I saw my friend Andrew, who grew up in a deeply religious family, and everything that he did brought this power of conviction. And I saw my friend Shelby, who wanted to be a fashion designer and would spend her days creating little outfits and costumes for her dolls. This amazingly eclectic group with all of these different interests and passions and things that motivated us. But when we came together, we were inseparable. We were a team, and what did we do? We were a source of safety for one another. We protected each other from those schoolyard bullies, or maybe it was that parent who was having a bad day. But it was more than just that safety. It was that place where we could learn, where we could grow, where we could be exposed to new ideas, new passions, things we'd never heard about before, where we felt safe to share those things with one another because we knew nobody would make fun of us. And at a really fundamental level, it was a place of joy. And it was where we found happiness in that idyllic childhood. And I tell this story not because I'm feeling nostalgic for home, which I am a little bit, but more so because it taps into this very basic shared psychological need that we as humans all have, and that is the need to belong. And we feel that belonging from our earliest childhoods as we forge those relationships, we forge those friendships, as we seek out those social networks and those points of connection throughout our lives. But that idea of belonging isn't just in our personal worlds. We bring it to work every day as well. And so that's what I'd like to talk with you all about, is this idea of belonging and how it belongs and how it can manifest in our workplaces as a source not just of joy, but also something that's really important and really valuable to businesses as well. You know, I spend my days as a practitioner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I travel the world working with organizations, helping them think about how do we design a DEI strategy? What are the pieces of it? How do we bring it to life? How do we make it happen? And we long ago in this field recognized and realized that diversity inside of an organization cannot exist if people do not feel included and do not feel that they belong. Otherwise, that diversity is effectively a waste of energy. And just like those psychologists tell us, that feeling of inclusion matters for absolutely everybody. And in fact, when we go and survey employees across countries, across industries, genders, racial and ethnic identities, it's always the same story. Inclusion really matters. And in fact, even when we go and talk to straight, cisgendered, racial majority men, you know, even they tell us inclusion is a really important part of how they think about picking a job or staying in a job. And so we've known for a very long time that there's something really important here for us to solve for. But the reality is as practitioners, we haven't actually always had a great sense of how we do it. And you know, it seems pretty fundamental, but I think if you were to ask just about any diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner in any organization, how do you even define inclusion? They would probably all give you a slightly different answer. Everybody is trying different solutions without really knowing what works and why, and are we actually doing the right things to solve for inclusion? And then there's this final piece, which is, does it even actually matter? Beyond it feeling good and tapping into that psychological need that we all share, is it actually good business? That's what I want to talk about today. So we went out into the world and we tried to answer these questions. And we went and we spoke to almost 30,000 people across a broad range of countries, across a broad range of identities, and asked them a really simple set of questions around, do you feel included or not? And then a set of questions around what are the ingredients that contribute to you feeling included? What are your companies doing? And then as well with that, what outcomes does it actually change? What does it change about what you experience, but then what you do when you come to work every day? And from there, we built something that we call our BCG BLISS index. And you can see the acronym up on the board, but it was intended to be a very simple yet powerful tool that got to the heart of those questions that we were trying to answer. What does it mean to feel included, really? And if we were to really define it so that we could measure it, how would we actually get to that definition? And then from there, what can we actually do about it? What actions can workplaces take that are really statistically correlated to a difference in outcomes? In other words, it's an analytical, statistically rigorous way at getting at something that's actually pretty hard to wrap your arms around because it is so emotional. It is such a feeling-based experience. But we wanted to bring a real science to how we unlock inclusion inside organizations. And so the first piece is, what is it? And you know, as we're going to talk through today, I want you to anchor on these four things that show up on the screen, because this is really what that feeling of inclusion can be distilled down to. Feeling like you belong is number 3, and it's probably the one that we all kind of think about immediately. But there are several others that show up time and time again as being most important. The first is you need to feel valued and respected. When that isn't in place, we don't feel like we're part of the team. When we don't feel like our contributions, our participation matters, of course we don't feel included. So feeling valued, feeling respected. Believing your perspectives matter. It's not enough to just have it be heard, but that it actually makes a difference, that it's acted upon. And then the last one, you know, that sits at the bottom of the screen is that we actually feel supported in our physical and mental well-being. And when I talked about that memory from childhood, there was a piece of it, which is, those were the kids on the playground that helped protect me when my interests were strange, or I was that kind of weird kid growing up in Canada. They were there. They were my physical support. They were my mental support when time was hard. And that exact same feeling manifests in how we think about whether or not we feel included at work. Next question, now that we know what it is, does it actually matter? And the answer is a resounding yes. And so when we actually take a look at a very simple set of outcomes, we see very strong statistical correlations between feelings of inclusion and those outcomes. The first one is happiness. And I think all of us would love to be happy at work, but happiness actually matters. For those of you who work in the space of HR work, or maybe even are an executive inside of an organization, you know that a happy workforce is an engaged workforce. An engaged workforce is a creative workforce, is a workforce that's able to team, is able to partner, is able to do great things together. And there is a very, very strong correlation between feelings of inclusion and happiness. And that is true for people of all demographic identities. The same is true of motivation. And again, if you're leading an organization, what do you want from your people? You want a motivated team, people who are excited to get up in the morning, to get dressed, to show up, to do wonderful things together. That motivation drives a profound impact on business outcomes. And then lastly, people who feel included stick around. And as we think about a world in which talent is scarce, in which we are always desperately trying to build teams with the people we need to get the job done, to drive the business forward, to do what we want to do, we need them to stay. And there is a profound linkage between my feeling of inclusion and whether or not I intend to stay in a company. And I recognize that's a pretty data-heavy page that I've put up on the screen, but I put it there for a reason, because if you were to extract the key insight from that page, what you see is intention to leave a company in the next year effectively drops in half when people feel included. That is amazing. And as we think about some of the biggest challenges that have confronted business professionals, especially in a post-COVID world where we've had such disruptions to talent, these are the types of outcomes that we would all be desperate to try to find, and we can find it through inclusion. So, amazing, right? We know what inclusion is. We know that it drives happiness, motivation, retention, all fantastic outcomes. So then we get to the last question: how do we actually get there? And what is it going to take for people to actually feel included? And this is where, again, we look to the research and we say there are a lot of things that we could try to do inside of our companies to create these feelings. But amazingly, it can all boil down into 4 big things that we can all do tomorrow in order to get started on this journey. It's not the total story, but these 4 things can actually make a remarkable difference in terms of progressing that organization towards feelings of inclusion for everybody inside the company. So the first one is senior commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this might seem obvious, right? I think all of us who have worked inside of organizations who've been committed to DEI, we know that when the CEO or the leader of the company says this is important and this is a priority, it matters. And we say, okay, this is a place where I want to work. This is good. But there's a big difference between asserting and actually getting things done. And this is where the real unlock on inclusion starts to come into play. The committed leader to DEI is not just asserting an ambition or asserting a statement out in the world, but they're actually manifesting that through action. And the way that they're manifesting that is they are taking a look at the totality of everything about how their company operates, how it influences the employee experience every day. And they're saying, how do I change those things in such a way that they work for more different types of people inside my company, and do so in such a way that they also, at the same time, deliver value to the business. So I work with one company in the United States, major frontline retailer, about 250,000 employees, and they've really taken this to heart. They took a look at those 250,000 employees and they said, we actually have a very sophisticated IT infrastructure that lets us manage scheduling. As you can imagine, thousands and thousands of retail outlets and people with different hours and needs and influxes of customers. It's a very complicated algorithm. And labor optimization is a really important lever in business performance if you are a retailer. But they said, that's kind of a one-sided equation. What if we were to actually talk to our employees and say, what are the constraints that you're facing as you come to work each day? What if you're a single mom and we keep changing your shifts every day and you can't manage for that childcare that's so critical for you to be able to continue working? What if you are that young person who's financially supporting a multi-generational household and you actually need to be able to make sure you're making enough money to pay the bills, but you don't know if you're going to get enough hours from week to week? Or what if you're that first-generation college student who's out there getting that university degree, who's going to become a professional, who's really going to do something extraordinary in this world, but your job keeps scheduling your hours on top of your classes? It doesn't work. And so they stepped back and they said, what if we were to rewrite the software that we use to schedule our teams? Not just making sure that we are using the minimum number of people to deliver the maximum number of hours and optimize our labor algorithm, all good things, but to do that with this lens of employee needs in mind. What have we done? We've created a business in which we see a dramatic reduction in employee call-outs, in turnover. People are able to stay in the job longer. All of that's great from a business performance standpoint. But we've also improved inclusion. Because what we've did is we've said it's so important for us to make jobs work for more different types of people. That is what this looks like. This is not simple statements made in a media press release, but this is real action, really getting into the fiber and the operations of the business to create a context where more different types of people can be successful and holding your team to account for doing it. So that's step number one. The second one, again, something that probably most of us in this room have experienced ourselves or are familiar with, but that is the importance of being able to look upwards and see who's in charge. And we have seen a profound linkage between feelings of inclusion and who sits on the leadership team inside the company. So how do we actually solve for that? There's two pieces to that. One is we need to take a look at who's actually sitting there today and what are the perceptions of the team in terms of how inclusive that group of humans actually is. We tend to think about a diverse leadership team and we immediately turn to thoughts of, okay, do I have gender diversity or do I have racial and ethnic diversity or the like? But when our junior folks are taking a look up at that leadership group, they're looking much more expansively than that. They're saying, do these people understand the world that I grew up in or that I'm living in every day? Can they relate to my personal life, to my context? Can I find a point of connection with these people that we resonate with one another? And one way I've seen real success inside organizations at getting at this is having leaders really engage in authentic conversations about who they are, what they've experienced, and finding ways to connect with their employees. I have one gentleman who was a longtime mentor for me. If you met him, he is 6'5" and was an Olympic volleyball player, a pretty remarkable human when you meet him, commands the room. The same individual grew up in the wartime Balkans and was a war refugee to the United States. And when he came to the US, he spent years learning to speak English, and to this day has panic attacks every time he has to give a speech, because he is so terrified that his accent will sound funny, that he might say the wrong word, that his grammar will be incorrect, and he goes into a spiral of self-doubt that he doesn't have the credibility or the capability to command a room. This is one of the most remarkable executives I've ever met in my career. And he shared this story with the young folks at his company. And it was such a moment of authenticity and such a moment of connection because they were able to look at him and they were able to say, you know, I am a young gay man who is terrified at people seeing my body language and outing me and realizing who I am. I'm afraid to speak in front of somebody. Or perhaps I'm somebody who grew up with a speech impediment and I've spent years learning to overcome that. I can relate to this story. And so the connection is forged. And yes, we haven't necessarily changed who is sitting in that box at the top of the house right away, but what we have done is create that point of connection in a very, very authentic way tied to life experience. And of course, the broader question becomes, well, how do we then change the composition of our leadership teams through time? And this is where we do need to get very, very creative. And some of the most innovative companies that I have seen in the world are doing exactly that. They're saying it's not enough for us to build leadership pipelines in our company by we go to the top universities and the top programs in our country and we siphon off those handful of people and we nurture them and make them feel special and incubate them. That's obviously part of the story, but it's insufficient, especially if we actually want to use that leadership representation in service not just of feelings of inclusion, but the overall impact that we as businesses can have in the world around us. And so one company that I work with is a consumer bank. And they've actually looked and they've said, we have thousands of highly interested and engaged folks that are working in our front lines at banks, but they don't have university degrees. But they're ambitious, and they want to be successful, and they are smart, but they need to be given the opportunity. And so we're going to create a program where we find those high potential folks who are out there working in our banks, and we're going to create a leadership incubation program that actually gives them a pathway into the corporate home office. And in doing so, they've actually built a cadre of executives who do not have formal secondary education. It's remarkable. And another client that I work with in Asia, working in the energy sector, has said, there is simply not a pipeline, period, of diverse talent who's making its way up through our education system because of structural inequities that have been built into the education system in this country. And so they have actually stood up university programs to build that cadre and to bring them forward. Innovative work happening to really, really expand who will ultimately sit at the top of the house. Third boils down to the people who we interact with as our managers every single day. And we talk about this as the importance of the manager creating a psychologically safe environment, which I know can be a little bit difficult to interpret what exactly that means, but it really boils down into a handful of things. It's about how we allow people to create. It's about how we allow people to grow. And it's really about how we allow people to challenge. And so when we think about the creation side of things, you know, this is where we really tap into those latent talents, that ingenuity, that creativity of everybody who is at the table. You know, I work with one technology company that was really struggling to do this. They had a very clear perspective about what a success model looked like for high potential talent inside their company. And they said, it's the people who come in and assert their opinion, and they come across as very entrepreneurial, and they take up space, et cetera. That didn't really work when you had an entire generation of engineers who were coming from cultures where respect for hierarchy and respecting when it's your time to speak was actually really, really important. And so from a cultural standpoint, they weren't behaving with a style in a way that allowed them to take that space, that allowed them to demonstrate what they were really capable of. And so they had to completely re-engineer not just how those frontline managers worked with those individuals every day so that they could draw out those capabilities, draw out that talent, but then also how they measured success on the back end. And they said, you know what, we're going to stop talking about people's style, and we're going to talk about their impact. What is it that they create? What is it that they contribute? What is it that they bring to the table? And all of a sudden, they were able to see far more success and an increase in inclusion scores amongst this diverse team of engineers who was working for them. You know, we talk a lot about the idea of how people grow. And I think probably every one of us in this room has worked for an organization where you're terrified to fail. It's a scary, scary thing. I know I call it the Sunday scaries. I wake up on Sunday morning, what am I going to mess up tomorrow, and am I going to get in trouble for it? It's tough. But creating a culture where people are not just not afraid to fail, but it's treated as a powerful learning experience is really important. For any of you who've worked in the technology sector or in companies that work with agile operating principles, like this is actually hardwired into the way companies work, where they have formal retrospectives at the end of each stage of work and say, hey, what went well, but also what didn't, and what can we learn from that, and how do we grow from that? And there's a real opportunity to bring that outside of those kind of cutting-edge technology-type spaces into our businesses more broadly. This was something I learned myself after working with one of those companies and actually brought it into the Boston Consulting Group. I was leading our Chicago office for a period of time, and we had a tendency as a company to basically create learning forums every Friday where people could celebrate the big successes. Where had we had huge impact on the market or done great things for our clients? And I changed that. I said, we're going to have Failure Fridays, where the goal is for you to show up and talk about your most epic disasters. And it was amazing, because all of a sudden these stories came out that people had been suppressing, right? Because nobody wants to talk about the time they messed up. But wow, what a learning experience. Because we all got to come together and say, wow, okay, so what would you do differently next time? What did we learn from this? How can we pull this into our own way of thinking? And it became something we laugh about. And all of a sudden, that thing that you were hiding because you didn't want anybody to know became the thing that made you cool and fun and popular that day. And now you were part of the group, and you were celebrating and laughing and really growing together. That's what this really looks like when we talk about psychological safety. And so the last one that I'll focus on really almost brings us back to the fundamentals of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think as we have over time, started to spend more and more energy talking about belongingness, inclusive behaviors. Do I fit in? Can everybody be successful here? We can't lose sight of the fact that at a very fundamental level, discrimination and bias still exists in a lot of organizations, and it is very deeply embedded, and we need to continue working on it. It is tightly bound to feelings of inclusion. And it happens at a very explicit level, and it also happens at a bit more of an implicit level as well. And so if we really want to unlock feelings of inclusion inside organizations, we cannot take our eye off the ball of discrimination and bias, and we have to create those safe mechanisms by which people can speak up when they experience things that are inappropriate and unacceptable. And so sometimes those overt things. And it's having that safe space to go to leadership and say, something has happened and it's not okay. In a lot of organizations, it means the creation of mechanisms like ombudsman programs, where there's somebody who is almost an objective third party inside the organization who can help to navigate when something happens. Critically important infrastructure to have in place. In addition to that, we need to start pushing further. And so as we think about processes that might exist, like recruitment processes, promotion processes, where are we seeing outcomes that adversely affect different populations of people? And how do we solve for them? Not just by saying, I'm going to set a recruitment target or a promotion target, and tomorrow I'm going to suddenly start promoting 40% women. But if that's not happening, why? It's been really interesting in the last 18 to 24 months as AI has become more pervasive and a more useful tool. We're actually starting to see the real power that AI can bring into these spaces. One organization that I recently worked with basically said, let's take all of the written reviews that we write up for our teams at the end of the year and push them through a natural language processing engine to actually see if there's patterns in how we talk about different communities of people. Lo and behold, profound patterns and differences in how successful men were described versus how successful women were described. And this feeling that women had and were expressing for a long time, saying, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel fair. But they couldn't necessarily point to, here was a day that a manager explicitly said something negative to me or something inappropriate to me. It was just a general sense that things weren't right. We started to surface through this natural language processing activity. And like I said, it was fascinating. In this particular organization, if we took 100 people who all were ranked as the absolute top in their spaces, and they were getting top scores and top bonuses and all these types of things, the men were very consistently described as having strong problem-solving skills, business acumen. They were sharp, they were intelligent, they were impactful. The women very consistently being described as great team players, great coaches, very collaborative. No judgment to be said. Those are two complementary and very important skill sets. But why? Why were we always pointing to one gender as having one set of them and one gender as the other? And when we actually then took a look at the longer term correlations with those performance factors and who was described in what way, the people that were described with the more traditionally masculine language saw longer term success. They were getting the big promotions. They were becoming the executives in the company. And so again, moving from those explicit biases, that explicit discrimination, to having to get underneath the surface of what's happening unconsciously. Because these are where we start to find those things where people will say, it just doesn't feel right, but there's no single incident or event that I could go to an ombudsman to try to solve for me. This allows us to try to surface those patterns so we can start to get at what's really underneath the surface. And so at the end of the day, I mean, it's 4 things. None of them easy to actually achieve, but it is 4 big things. It is really that commitment to DEI that starts at the executive level, but then manifests and is embedded throughout the operations of the company, done so in a way that supports the individual, but also makes good business sense. It's really driving towards that diverse representation in senior leadership, looking at how leaders who are there today can connect with their teams, and also innovatively building that pipeline of the leaders that are coming behind tomorrow. It's creating those psychologically safe team environments where people feel that they have the freedom to be creative, to operate in a way that's authentic to their own styles, to their own behavioral modes, where they can learn from their mistakes, where they can challenge authority, where they can be successful. And lastly, it's creating this space where we are continuing to push on discrimination and bias. We are finding it, we are weeding it out, and we are finding mechanisms to solve for it. If we can do those 4 things, and like I said, I describe them as 4 simple things. None of them are simple to actually activate, but they are 4 things. We can meaningfully move the needle on inclusion. And if we can meaningfully move the needle on inclusion, what do we unlock? We unlock that happiness, we unlock that motivation, and we unlock that retention. All powerful outcomes, both for the individual, for businesses, and for society as a whole. And with that, I thank you all for your time today.